I drive for a food delivery app on weekend nights, mostly because the tips are better and I've got a day job during the week that pays the actual bills. This job is supposed to be simple. Pick up the order, drop it off, move to the next one. Most nights it really is that simple. But there's one address that I still think about more than I'd like to admit. The first time I got the order, it was a Friday night, busier than usual because of some local event downtown. The app sent me to a house on Maple Hollow Drive, a quieter residential street about 10 minutes outside the main delivery zone I usually worked. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Addresses come and go. You stop paying attention to the specifics after a while. When I pulled up, the house looked off immediately. The structure was still standing, technically, but it was clearly damaged by fire. Blackened siding, a collapsed section of roof near the back, boarded windows on the first floor. Definitely not a place anyone was living in. I figured it was a mistake. Wrong address entered into the system, maybe a typo, maybe the app glitching. I called the customer's number listed on the order. It rang a few times before going to a generic voicemail with no name attached. I left the food on what was left of the porch steps, took a photo for the app's delivery confirmation like we're required to do, and left. I didn't think much more about it. Weird things happen on this job all the time. A week later, same app notification, same address. Maple Hollow Drive. This time I actually checked the order details before driving over, half expecting it to be some kind of system error repeating itself. The customer name was different from the first time. A different name entirely, different phone number too. I called this number as well, same result. No answer, generic voicemail. I drove out there anyway because the job pays based on completed deliveries, and I needed the money that week more than I needed peace of mind about a weird address. The house looked exactly the same as before. No change in the damage. No signs of anyone clearing debris or starting any kind of repair work. I left the food again, snapped my photo, and got out of there as quickly as I could. I mentioned it to one of the other drivers I sometimes talked to during slow nights at a gas station where a lot of US would park between orders. His name was Marcus, been doing this job longer than me. When I described the address, his face changed almost immediately. He told me he'd gotten orders sent there too. Multiple times over the past year, different customer names every time, same result. Empty burned-out house. No response, no explanation. He said the house had burned down a little over 2 years ago. He didn't know the full story, just neighborhood rumors mostly. But the fire had happened in the middle of the night, and from what he'd heard, at least one person hadn't made it out. That detail sat heavy with me for days after he told me. I want to be honest and say that at this point, I started actively avoiding accepting orders that routed anywhere near that street. The app doesn't show you the exact address until you've already accepted the order, so I started declining anything that looked even slightly like it might be heading toward that part of town, eating the small penalty hit to my acceptance rate, just to avoid the possibility. It worked for a while. About 3 weeks passed without incident. Then one night, the app sent me an order, and I didn't catch the street name until I was already most of the way there. Maple Hollow Drive again. I almost turned around. I seriously considered just eating the cancellation penalty and heading back to wait for a different order. But something made me keep driving. Maybe curiosity. Maybe some part of me wanted to prove to myself there was a logical explanation I just hadn't found yet. When I arrived, the order details listed yet another different customer name. I called the number, same generic voicemail as always. I got out of my car this time instead of just leaving the food and rushing off. I don't know exactly why. I walked closer to the house than I had on previous deliveries, close enough to see details I'd missed before in my hurry to leave. There was fresh damage. Not extensive, but recent. A section of the porch railing looked like it had been disturbed, splintered wood that hadn't been weathered by exposure yet. Like something had happened there very recently, separate from the original fire. I heard something from inside the house. A faint sound, almost like static, or maybe just wind moving through broken windows. I told myself it was nothing, the kind of sound any abandoned structure makes. Then I saw movement in one of the boarded windows. Not light, not anything I could clearly identify as a figure, just a shift in the darkness behind the boards, like something had passed close enough to block what little ambient light existed inside. I left the food where I always did and got back in my car fast. As I was pulling away, I glanced in my rearview mirror, almost involuntarily, just to look back at the house one more time. For just a second, I saw a shape standing on the porch where I'd left the food. A dark silhouette, roughly the size and shape of a person, standing completely still near the front door. I didn't stop. I didn't go back to check. I just drove. I looked into the fire after that night, actually researched it instead of relying on rumors and half-stories from other drivers. I found a short local news article from a little over 2 years prior. A house fire on Maple Hollow Drive, caused by an electrical malfunction according to investigators. One resident, an elderly woman who lived alone, hadn't made it out in time. I don't know if it was her ordering food from a house she no longer technically owned, or lived in, or existed within in any way that makes logical sense. I don't know who keeps placing these orders, using different names, different numbers that all lead to dead ends. I've been doing food delivery for about a year now, mostly evenings and weekends to supplement my main income. You start to notice patterns in this job after a while. Regular customers, regular tipping habits, the kind of orders that come from the same handful of neighborhoods every week. Nothing about this particular delivery seemed unusual when I accepted it. That's what makes it stick with me even now. It was a Thursday night, slower than the weekends, but still steady enough to keep me busy. The order came through for a house in a neighborhood I delivered to plenty of times before, a fairly established residential area with older homes, the kind of place where most people have lived for years and know their neighbors. The order itself was simple. A standard takeout order from a local restaurant, paid in cash, which had become rare enough in this job that I actually noticed it. Most people pay through the app these days. Cash payments meant I had to collect the exact amount or make change on the spot. A small inconvenience, but nothing alarming. I picked up the food and drove to the address. Nothing about the house stood out. A modest single-story home, lights on inside, a car in the driveway. Completely unremarkable in every way that mattered. I knocked on the door, and a man answered within a few seconds, like he'd been waiting right on the other side. He paid in cash, handed me the exact amount without needing change, thanked me, and took the food inside. No conversation beyond the basic transaction. No tip beyond what was already factored into the delivery fee, which again, wasn't unusual enough to think twice about. I didn't think about this delivery again until almost 2 weeks later, when I was scrolling through a local community page on social media, the kind of group people use for neighborhood updates, lost pets, that sort of thing. There was a missing persons post. A man reported missing by his family, last seen almost 3 weeks prior. The photo attached to the post stopped me completely. It was the same man who had answered the door and paid me in cash. I stared at my phone for a long time, scrolling back and forth between the photo and my memory of that delivery. The resemblance wasn't vague or coincidental in the way these things sometimes are. It was the same face, same build, even the same kind of casual clothing he'd been wearing when he answered the door. According to the post, he'd been missing for almost 3 weeks at that point, which meant, if I was doing the math correctly, he had already been missing for several days before I delivered food to him at that address. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe he'd been found, and the post just hadn't been updated yet. Maybe I was misremembering details, conflating 2 different deliveries in my mind. I checked my delivery history through the app, found the exact date and address of that order, and cross-referenced it against the date listed on the missing persons post. The math didn't work in any way that made sense. He was supposed to have already been gone. I considered just letting it go. Plenty of people look similar to each other, and maybe I was building a narrative out of nothing more than a passing resemblance amplified by an overactive imagination. But something about the specificity bothered me. The cash payment. The exact change ready without hesitation, like he'd been prepared for the delivery in advance. I decided to drive back to that address a few days later, not to deliver anything, just to look at the house again, see if anything seemed different. The house looked the same from the outside. Same car in the driveway. Actually, which struck me as strange if the resident had genuinely been missing for weeks. Cars don't usually sit untouched in a driveway for that long without someone noticing, especially in a neighborhood where people clearly knew each other. I parked across the street for a few minutes, debating whether to knock on the door or just leave. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to walk over and knock, telling myself I'd just ask if everything was okay. Maybe mention I thought I recognized someone from a missing persons post. Nobody answered. I knocked a second time, waited, still nothing. The lights I remembered being on during my delivery were off this time, the house sitting in near total darkness despite it being evening. As I turned to walk back to my car, I noticed something through a gap in the curtains of the front window. A faint shape moving inside. The kind of movement that suggests someone shifting position rather than walking purposefully through a room. I stood frozen on the sidewalk for a moment, watching, but the movement didn't repeat. I left without knocking again. I reported what I'd seen to the local police non-emergency line a few days later, gave them the address, explained the connection I'd noticed between the missing persons post and my delivery. The officer who took my report seemed mildly interested, said they'd look into it, but I never heard anything further. No follow-up call. No update on the case that I could find through any public channels. I checked the community page periodically over the following weeks. The missing persons post remained active, no updates, no resolution mentioned. The man's family had left comments expressing their continued concern, asking if anyone had any information. I never told them what I knew, mostly because what I knew didn't actually amount to anything concrete. A delivery, a face that matched a photo, a house that may or may not have had someone moving inside it weeks after he was reported missing. I stopped accepting delivery requests for that particular neighborhood after that, the same way some drivers I know avoid certain addresses for their own private reasons. I tell myself it's just caution, an overabundance of it maybe, but I can't shake the image of him handing me exact change that night. Like he already knew exactly how much he needed, like the whole interaction had been planned and rehearsed by someone, or something, that understood the routine perfectly without actually being the person it appeared to be. I still wonder sometimes whether I delivered food to a missing man, or to something wearing his face well enough to fool a stranger standing on a porch for less than 30 seconds. I don't have an answer. I'm not sure I want one.